The Greek historian Polybius witnessed firsthand the dramatic rise of the Roman Republic. When he was taken to Rome as a hostage in 167 BC, he set out not just to chronicle Rome's meteoric ascent from backwater Italian city to the great power of the Mediterranean, but also to explain it, and to a certain extent, justify it. Polybius concluded that Rome owed its strength to the brilliance of its constitution and a divided government that seamlessly blended elements of aristocracy, democracy, and monarchy to achieve balance and prevent any one faction from accumulating excessive power. So while consuls held temporary monarchical authority, they were frequently checked by the Senate's aristocratic influence. The people, though removed from the offices of government, wielded the power to elect officials and influence decisions through advocacy, direct action, or their representatives, the tribunes. Down to the present, many have shared Polybius's assessment, and it was their familiarity with the classical world that encouraged America's founders to establish a system with three distinct branches that were capable of counteracting the others if necessary. But though many Western nations have adopted constitutions based on Rome's system, the Romans themselves were never hesitant to disregard their supposedly ideal approach to perfectly balanced government whenever they felt it was necessary, usually through the naming of a dictator in times of crisis or desperation. The dictator stood outside the traditional system of Roman government. Though accountable to the Senate and subject to the tribune's veto within the city, the dictator otherwise held near absolute power for 6 months, or until the specific crises that necessitated his appointment was resolved. It says much about the character of the Romans that though they held universal antipathy toward kings, they nonetheless placed their faith in certain exemplars of virtue with absolute powers when necessary, fully trusting that the dictator would lay down his office when the task was complete and not seek to retain power indefinitely. The story of Cincinnatus, who attained the dictatorship, led Rome to military victory over the Equii, and resigned, all in just 16 days, may have been embellished by historians like Livy, but he was the standard to which all dictators were held. The exalted nature of the office and the virtue of the men who filled it marks a sharp distinction between how Romans viewed dictators and the considerably more negative modern denotation of the word. For over 400 years, Roman dictators seem to have behaved in a manner that justified the immense trust the Republic had placed in them. But in 82, a bloodthirsty patrician named Lucius Cornelius Sulla would march on Rome for the second time and seize power in the wake of a devastating civil war, using his army to pressure the Comitia Centuriata into naming him the first Roman dictator since the Second Punic War, but also failing to put an end date on his term in office. Sulla decreed that he would be dictator indefinitely, and thus would begin a reign of reactionary terror that redefined Rome forever, illustrating that the rule of law was a fantasy, and that, in the words of Julius Caesar, the Republic is nothing, merely a name without body or shape. As dictator, Sulla's first order of business was the eradication of his political foes through a series of bloody purges known as the proscriptions. Sulla smashed Roman law and precedent to authorize manhunts by roving death squads for anyone associated with the popular cause, allowing for the execution of anyone without trial. The property of these victims, and anyone who helped them, was confiscated, leading to many men being added to the lists simply because Sulla or his allies coveted their property. The rostra in the Forum that served as the platform for Rome's greatest orators became a monument to death, as the severed heads of the condemned were displayed to drive home the dire consequences of resistance to Sulla's regime. Sulla intentionally cultivated an environment of uncertainty and suspicion in Rome. Every day, new names were added to the lists. Everyone in Rome began to fear for their own safety, and it was not long before every family in the city was touched by the spread of death and destruction. A true death toll is unknowable, but we have the names of over 520 victims, including more than 50 senators. But the actual body count was likely in the thousands, as Sulla's brutes rampaged through the city, murdering plebeians with impunity. Anyone who had once stood with the popular cause, whether a disciple of the Gracchi, Saturninus, Marius, or Cinna, was either killed or forced to flee the city. But adding salt to the wound, the sons of these men lost the ability to stand for office, and many were themselves forced into exile. Treason had been redefined from disloyalty to Rome to simply opponents of the current regime. Sulla claimed to be serving as dictator to reconstitute the Roman Republic, but he was now the closest thing Rome had seen to a monarch since expelling the hated Tarquinius Superbus. He claimed to be upholding Roman law, but had stripped untold thousands of their fundamental rights as citizens. It's shameful that so many historians, and even more armchair historians, buy into Sulla's propaganda and take his professed aims at face value. In doing so, they place more of an emphasis on his words than his actions. This is always a faulty method for judging someone's character, and its deficiency is only more pronounced when appraising someone with as much blood on their hands as Sulla. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. With the popular party smashed, his allies enriched off the ill-gotten property of the proscribed, and his unconstitutional hold on the dictatorship secured, Sulla instituted a series of repressive reforms designed to strip the masses of the meager rights and privileges that they had accumulated under decades of successful populari reforms. According to Sulla and his aristocratic backers, the root cause of all the damage and chaos was the increasing prominence of the tribune of the plebs. Though since the Gracchi this office had amassed no extra powers in the constitutional sense, the willingness of some elites serving in this magistracy to act as class traitors and work on behalf of Rome's poor and downtrodden allowed for them to leverage the considerable influence of the tribunate to pass critical reforms that significantly improved the lives of Rome's common people. But in making Rome begin to work for all Romans, the populares drew the ire of the reactionaries who take personal offense to social progress of any kind. To rein in the tribunate, Sulla violated Rome's ancestral constitution by directing his energies as dictator not against the enemies of Rome, but against the fabric of the republic itself. Under his new reforms, tribunes could no longer convene assemblies or propose laws, and lost their veto power over public business. The tribunes, who had once served as the rallying point for popular sentiment and the chief advocates for the working class, were now politically powerless. Furthermore, anyone who served as tribune was barred from holding further elected office. By limiting its powers and transforming the tribunate into a political dead end, Sulla ensured that no men of ambition would use the office to build a strong popular following. Sulla even removed the ability of Romans to elect priests to the state cults. Religious offices were now filled by the cults, allowing for the elite to insulate themselves within these prestigious posts. But perhaps the most egregious slap in the face to the average Roman was the abolishing of the subsidized grain dole that many poor plebeians had depended on to stave off the threat of starvation. The elite had always been opposed to the grain dole because by allowing the Roman poor to achieve a tolerable standard of living, it weakened their ability to bribe the masses with their own personal food distribution programs. The elite wanted Romans to depend on their private charity instead of a state-backed program, and thus to be beholden to their influence. Sulla was happy to eliminate the popular and successful program, instantly making the lives of Rome's poor much more precarious and increasing the influence of Rome's nobility. Far from strengthening Rome's constitution, Sulla had effectively crippled one of the three legs of its tripod. He had taken away much from the plebeians and given them nothing in return. But what he took from the poor, he gave to the rich. Sulla had stripped power and influence from the common people, but increased the authority of the Senate. Sulla and the elite faction that backed him were, after all, no opponents of class warfare. They were active participants who believed the aristocrats of the Senate were the natural rulers of Rome, and the commoners were not fit for anything more than military service, farming, or hard labor. Whereas previously there was no requirement that magistrates received the consent of the Senate before taking legislative proposals to the assemblies, Sulla made senatorial approval necessary before any bills could go to the people to become law. The veto power that tribunes had lost now effectively resided in the Senate chamber, and nothing could occur without its approval. Furthermore, Sulla now gave senators control over the courts. Thus, senators alone would serve as jurors. The decision to strengthen the Senate was the inevitable outcome of Sulla's deeply conservative vision for the Roman state. as he sought to bring back what he viewed as the glory days of the Republic before the contagion of popular agitation introduced by the Gracchi. But like many reactionaries, Sulla was nostalgic for a past that never actually existed. Records show that there were many populari reformers before the Gracchi, and that the Senate had never actually enjoyed the indisputable prominence or influence afforded to it by his new constitution. Though he was ignorant of this, Sulla did know that by concentrating so much power in the Senate, it became all the more vital that this body stay under his influence. To achieve this, he doubled the size of the Senate from 300 to 600, filling it with sycophants, allies, and wealthy aristocrats from across Italy that he knew could be trusted to vote according to his preferences. By making the Senate larger, Sulla also significantly decreased the power and prestige of each individual senator. The only real winners here were Sulla and his inner clique of reactionary allies that new senators looked to for guidance. Sulla followed this same tactic with the magistracies, increasing the number of praetors and quaestors. He also formally codified the requirements for holding each office into the cursus honorum. The new posts provided new opportunities for more men to embark on political careers via these offices instead of through the tribunate. But since each magistrate held veto power over the action of any colleague in the same office, increasing the number of office holders made it easier to find at least one magistrate that would keep potential radicals in check. Sulla's reforms were far-reaching, but by striking out to empower the elite at the expense of all others, they took little account of actual power dynamics in the city. Sulla's constitution had such little backing that its days were numbered as soon as Sulla resigned from office in 80, and work was immediately underway to roll back much of his constitution after his death in 78. It speaks to the remarkable unpopularity of these laws that though Sulla had utterly smashed all plebeian political organization in Rome, opponents immediately materialized once the threat of his death squads dissipated. Rome's alienated masses and apolitical citizens had been radicalized by the Sullan constitution. It is no surprise, then, that Caesar referred to Sulla as a political illiterate. The grain dole was reinstated in 78, and tribunes won the right to hold further office in 75, with expansions to the dole in 73 and full restoration of the tribunate in 70 by the consuls Pompey and Crassus. By any measure, Sulla and his constitution were abject failures, for while Sulla's most ideological reforms were quickly abandoned, his stated goal of saving the Republic was his most profound failure and the one that had the most lasting consequences. Sulla himself had come to power as a military dictator, and had sought to enact strict rules that would prevent another magistrate or provincial governor from fomenting civil war. But in reality, all Sulla did was set an example to a new generation of Roman politicians that absolute power could be had if you marched on Rome with an army at your back. Sulla thought he was ending history, but he was really just setting a precedent, and his successor as dictator would be the young Roman who he feared most, the nephew by marriage of his great rival Marius, one Gaius Julius Caesar, who built his political career on opposition to the Sullan constitution. It is easy to acknowledge Sulla as a monster, but there has been a tendency by too many to craft a feckless both sides narrative that casts Sulla and his opponents as two sides of the same demagogic coin. This false balance elides the real history, that time and time again it was popular reformers who were murdered en masse by the Roman oligarchy. The Gracchi, Saturninus, Drusus, all met grisly ends alongside untold numbers of nameless supporters and followers. It was always the populares who bled, and always men like Sulla who held the knife. Anyone who seeks to defend his reaction to the success of populari reformers as somehow appropriate deserves full condemnation. Those who advance such nonsense often betray their own feelings about modern politics, as well as their belief that social progress and improved rights for the marginalized are provocations that should be met with bloodshed. The dominant view today is evolving beyond the apologia of past generations, and Sulla is increasingly seen by mainstream historians as a power-hungry tyrant whose dedication to crushing popular reforms set dangerous precedents and ultimately weakened the Republic. However, while the vilification of Sulla is welcome and is indeed a necessary antidote to past interpretations of him, this indictment must be shared by the entire elite class who backed Sulla. Believing that the bloody prescriptions and repressive reforms can all be pinned on a single individual is to subscribe to the great man theory of history, where supermen act unimpeded by the material realities or power structures of their societies. Not only is the great man theory of history deficient for gaining insight into historical truth, even if it were useful, it would hardly be applicable here, as Sulla was no great man, but instead a vain, selfish, and reactionary brute. But while the opinion of Sulla among historians ebbs further with each passing generation, a new contingent of online reactionaries has embraced the tyrannical dictator, not in spite of the death and misery that he brought to Rome, but because of it. Though we have come a long way in the 2,000 years since Sulla, we are unfortunately still not rid of the belief that bloodshed is the appropriate response to the cries of the oppressed. For example, the fascist dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile followed Sulla's playbook to the letter when it seized power in 1973 in a US-backed coup against the popularly elected leftist government of Salvador Allende. What followed was a torrent of blood and repression directed at thousands upon thousands of activists, organizers, and journalists. Like Sulla, Pinochet and his vile henchmen enjoyed the bloodshed, but they also carried it out with a goal in mind, as Pinochet immediately enacted extreme, neoliberal free market reforms at the behest of Milton Friedman that placed more power and wealth in the hands of the elite. We can understand, then, why the myth of Sulla as a principled reformer persists. It is so valuable to the powerful to present the man whose violence, greed, and political ineptitude brought about the end of the Republic as a patriot, who was simply doing what needed to be done. It's a lie that is often trotted out to defend the most reprehensible behavior imaginable and attempt to convince us of the necessity of cruelty to protect the status quo. Combating the brutality of political reactionaries means exposing Sulla and his ilk for what they truly were, and reminding prospective strongmen
that in the end, tyranny always collapses, and no one escapes the judgment of history.